right, holy lace, Batman. This is all about yarn overs. Yarn overs are that wonderful thing that actually makes lace lace. Without the holes, it would just be really open stockinette, and that really wouldn't be that exciting. So there's a bunch of different kinds of yarn overs. I'm just going to give you a really basic overview of kind of what they do and what their purpose is and how they're made. Now, one thing that you'll probably run into, depending on where you get your pattern or who wrote it or what country it is, you're going to see different nomenclature. The standard is yarn over, Y-O. You might see O, as in just over. You might see YFWD for yarn forward. There's YON, which is yarn over needle. There's all sorts of things. Really, all they're describing is the same thing, just depending on where you are in the pattern, you might have to make a slightly different motion. So all of those little bits of nomenclature, a lot of them are actually standard for British patterns. That's where you'll see the yarn forward, yarn over needle, YRN, things like that. They're all describing the exact same stitch, but done between different other stitches. So depending on if you're purling at the time or if you're knitting at the time, you'll have to move the yarn a little bit differently because you're starting with it either in the front of the work or in the back of the work, and then your next stitch is either in the front of the work or the back of the work. Ultimately, it's the same stitch. It's just a yarn over. The only variation that I know of that is truly different is a backwards yarn over, and that is basically you wrap the yarn the opposite way around the needle, and you can create better leaning, double decreased areas where you have matched yarn overs, and they look lovely, sitting next to each other instead of having all the yarn overs go the same direction. But when it comes right down to it, it's such a minor difference that you really won't notice it, and all that really matters is that the yarn over's the right size. So this is just a big fat piece of worsted weight crummy lace on big fat needles, just to kind of give you an idea. Your lace will look crappy before you block it, trust me. So if it's starting to look kind of like a crumbled mess, don't worry about it, it's going to look fine. So this is just kind of giving you an idea. These are just basic yarn overs. All the ones done in the first row here, these are all done the standard yarn over way. These ones are all backwards yarn overs. Can you see the difference? Good, because I can't either. So this is a double yarn over, or a matched pair made with yarn overs going the same direction, yarn overs going opposite directions, and then yarn overs going the opposite direction of the first pair. And again, there really is very little difference that you'll see in something like that. Where you really get into the big differences is when you have to do multiples. So when setting up for a multiple yarn over, depending on which way you're going, if it's going to be the kind of thing where it's so big, like in this Janet shawl, that you actually have to essentially cast on extra stitches, bind off and cast on and do things like that, that's not really a yarn over. So when doing any kind of large multiple yarn overs like this, you just have to look at the stitches around it. That's the most important thing. So if you're going to be increasing in the number of stitches, the decreases near that yarn over, or corresponding to it in another row, you'll have fewer decreases than you do increases. So let's say you knit two together, you do 4 yarn overs, and then you SSK on the other side, you're increasing 2 stitches. So that you'll usually see when you've got a center out round shawl and you're trying to increase really fast, you'll have something like that. In this case, I just knit 3 together on one side, SSK on the other, and did 4 yarn overs. Now when you do multiple yarn overs, and I'll just show you real quick, when you're doing multiple yarn overs, you just yarn over the way you normally would, except you do it several times. So instead of just doing it once, do it 2, 3, 4 times. And the only thing to keep in mind is when you're going back in the other direction. So you just work up to where you're going to put your yarn overs, and in this case I will increase, so I'm not going to do any decreases around it. I'm just going to put a nice big fat hole here. So you would just wrap the yarn several times around and keep knitting, and this is going to increase 4 stitches here. So I'm just going to turn it around and go back and show you. When you get back up to this, and in this case I'm doing a stockinette lace. When you get back to it, what you're going to need to do is knit into, or in this case purl, into the back of the stitch the normal way, and then purl into the front of the next yarn over, which might be a little weird, but then you purl into the back like you normally would, and then purl into the front. So that basically, if you try to actually purl or knit into all of them, you just lose your whole bunch of yarn overs in like a little bit of SpaghettiOs there. But that creates one giant hole with really very little effort. And so this one here is done in 2 colors, so you can kind of see what happens here. You can see the dark blue is where all the yarn overs were made, and the light blue is where all of them were purled into, either front or back. And what happens here, you just see essentially just one long piece of yarn just gets kind of wrapped around a couple of the stitches. So it's not creating any extra bulk, it's just essentially making a giant hole that then you sort of do this knitted cast on into it. That's essentially what sort of happens. And then essentially you've got this big increased area, and if you did even more yarn overs on top of it, you'd end up with a big old wedge. So the multiple yarn overs, they're a little tricky at first, but they're actually quite simple. Another thing you might want to practice. It's really just a way of increasing rapidly or creating a very large space. And when you're looking at your pattern and you're thinking, I don't understand how this works, because usually what you'll see is in one little spot on your chart, it'll just be a yarn over with like a 4 in it. And that's yarn over 4 times. You're thinking, but why is it only taking up one space on my chart? Well, look in that row. If you have 4 decreases in that row that are taking up the extra stitches that would be added with that yarn over, then it only needs to take up 1 spot, because essentially you've taken out as many stitches as you're putting back in. So it evens out. So it looks a little weird on paper. It looks really weird when you first knit it, but when you actually spread out your piece and you see these amazingly beautiful holes in your lovely piece of knitting, you are going to love the yarn over.